We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious.
The United States has taken control of Venezuela, militarily, politically, and now economically. President Nicolas Maduro is in US custody. American forces were on Venezuelan soil, and President Donald Trump has declared that Washington will run the country until a transition is completed. So they could very well return. For India, this is a moment of sharp contradiction. Publicly, New Delhi has expressed deep concern. Quietly, however, one of the biggest geopolitical shakeups in Latin America in decades may have unlocked $1 billion opportunity for Indian energy giants. So while India walks a diplomatic tightrope between Washington, D.C. and the global south, could Reliance Industries and ONGC Videsh be holding a golden ticket hidden inside Trump's Venezuela takeover? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. India's response to US action in Venezuela was measured to the point of caution. No condemnation, no invocation of international law, no reference to sovereignty or the UN Charter. Indian Ministry of External Affairs spoke of recent developments, neutral language for a full-scale military intervention, and the capture of a sitting head of state. The wording was deliberate. India expressed deep concern, said it was closely monitoring the evolving situation, urged dialogue, and underlined the safety of Indian nationals who are fewer than 100 people. What India did not do was name the United States of America. It did not criticize President Trump, and it did not align itself with the sharp denunciations issued by China, Russia, Brazil. Even Europe seemed largely divided by Trump's action.
Well, it certainly appears to be strategic restraint because there are some very delicate negotiations underway with the United States. We have an unprecedented situation of US tariffs on India, more than 50%. It's the highest in the world. 25% of it, which is for buying Russian oil. There is an India-US trade deal under negotiation as well. And to top it all, we have a mercurial US president, possibly one of the lowest points that have been reached in India-US ties in the last 25 years. And India's MEA is very clear that it doesn't want to do anything or say anything right now to rock the boat.
China called America's action a grave violation of international law and demanded Maduro's immediate release. Russia described it as armed aggression. Brazil warned of a dangerous precedent that could plunge the world into chaos. India did none of that. This silence is not confusion, it is calculation. India is negotiating a trade deal with the Trump administration. It is still smarting from 50% tariffs imposed by Washington, including penalties over Russian oil purchases. Delhi knows that public outrage today could translate into economic punishment tomorrow. But there is another reason for restraint, one that has nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with oil. Venezuela is not just another crisis zone. It holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels. And buried under years of sanctions, mismanagement, and isolation are stranded Indian investments worth billions of dollars. At the center of the story is ONGC Videsh, India's overseas oil arm. For years, OVL has been trapped in Venezuela by US sanctions. Fields it owns are dry not because the oil isn't there, but because it could not bring in rigs, equipment, or even audit its accounts. OVL holds a 40% stake in the San Cristobal onshore oil field in eastern Venezuela. On paper, the field is commercially viable. In reality, production collapsed to barely 5,000 to 10,000 barrels per day. Why? Because sanctions blocked access to drilling rigs, services, spare parts, everything required to keep the wells alive. Then there is the money Venezuela owes India. Over $536 million in unpaid dividends up to 2014, and nearly the same amount again for the years after that. Frozen because Venezuelan authorities refused audits. In total, close to $1 billion locked away by sanctions and chaos.
Well, that is dependent on a number of imponderables. It all depends on how Trump reacts to this interim government that's in place in Venezuela, whether the sanctions are going to be relaxed. There is a lot of Indian money that's locked up there in Venezuela, unpaid dues of between $500 to $600 million. The infrastructure over there is broken. So all of this could take several years to fix, the infrastructure to fix. And of course, it entirely depends on what the United States does with the interim government, how it reacts to this interim government, and of course, what it does with the sanctions, because this entire crisis was caused by the US imposing sanctions, leading to a lot of Indian assets being locked up in Venezuela.
That money has been sitting on OVL's books as unresolved claims, stranded assets, dead capital, until now. Trump's takeover of Venezuela changes the equation overnight. Under US control, sanctions are expected to be selectively eased. American oil majors are already set to return. Infrastructure will be refurbished, exports restarted, and critically, companies that were previously blocked may now be allowed to operate under US licenses. For OVL, this is a potential reset. Officials say that once restrictions ease, ONGC can move rigs from its fields in Gujarat to San Cristobal. The technology is similar, the equipment is available. What was missing now was permission, and that might just happen now. With new wells and proper infrastructure, San Cristobal alone can produce between 80,000 and 100,000 barrels per day. That is not a marginal increase, that is a transformation from a stranded asset to a producing field with serious cash flow. And OVL's exposure doesn't end there. An international consortium led by Indian firms, OVL, Indian Oil Corporation, Oil India, along with Repsol of Spain and Petronas of Malaysia, won rights back in 2008 to develop a massive project in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt, Carabobo 1, another heavy oil field, another investment frozen by sanctions. Under a US-managed oil sector, analysts say those projects could be revived. The US cannot replace every international company overnight. It will need partners, it will need expertise, and it will need assured markets, something India brings to the table. This is where Reliance Industries enters the picture. Reliance, India's refining giant, had already secured a license from the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control in 2024 to import Venezuelan crude, despite sanctions. But trade never really took off. That could now change dramatically. Reliance has a 15-year crude supply contract with Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA. Indian refineries are technically configured to process Venezuelan heavy crude, something many refineries elsewhere cannot do efficiently. If Venezuelan exports restart under US oversight, Reliance stands to gain long-term supply security at competitive prices. For India, this offers something even bigger: diversification. India is the world's third largest oil importer. For years, it has relied heavily on the Middle East or West Asia, and more recently on discounted Russian oil. Both come with geopolitical risks. Venezuelan crude offers a strategic alternative. It strengthens India's hand in price negotiations. It reduces exposure to shocks in West Asia. And at a time when Washington wants India to reduce dependence on Russian barrels, Venezuelan oil becomes a convenient substitute without angering the US. Before sanctions, India was importing over 400,000 barrels per day from Venezuela. At its peak, crude trade between the two touched over $7 billion annually. That relationship collapsed after 2019. Now, Trump's move could resurrect it, on Washington's terms though. But this is where the tightrope becomes dangerous. Publicly, India cannot endorse a US military takeover of a sovereign country. Many in the global south are watching New Delhi, expecting leadership against unilateralism. Brazil has already condemned Washington. South Africa has called for the UN Security Council to intervene.
I remain deeply concerned that rules of international law have not been respected with regard to the 3 January military action. The Charter enshrines the prohibition of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The maintenance of international peace and security depends on the continued commitment of all member states to adhere to all the provisions of the Charter. Mr. President, Venezuela has experienced decades of internal instability and social and economic turmoil. Democracy has been undermined. Millions of its people have fled the country. The situation is critical, but it is still possible to prevent a wider and more destructive conflagration. I call on all Venezuelan actors to engage in an inclusive, democratic dialogue in which all sectors of society can determine their future.
India, however, is silent because privately, the economic upside is too large to ignore. There is also a larger geopolitical shift at play. Venezuelan oil under US control weakens China's leverage. Beijing currently enjoys priority access to Venezuelan crude through debt repayment deals. A restructuring of PDVSA under Washington could renegotiate or even dismantle those arrangements. That opens space for India. Long-term contracts, equity oil, strategic supply security. For the global oil market, Venezuelan barrels returning could stabilize prices. But Trump has his own calculus. He does not want oil prices to fall below $60 a barrel. That would hurt US shale producers. Analysts say Washington may pressure OPEC to cut output to accommodate Venezuelan flows without crashing prices. This sends a message not just to the market but to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. With Venezuelan oil under US control, Washington reduces its dependence on OPEC. Energy becomes another lever of American power, and petrodollar becomes more relevant. India must navigate all of this without slipping. If India speaks too loudly against the takeover, it risks trade retaliation. If it stays silent, it risks losing credibility in the global south. And if it miscalculates, it could lose access to one of the most valuable energy opportunities in a decade. India's official statement reflects this dilemma. Carefully worded, non-confrontational, focused on stability, not legality. It is diplomacy designed to buy time. The irony is striking. A US action that many see as a violation of international norms could end up rescuing Indian investments, reviving stranded oil fields, and unlocking nearly $1 billion for Indian companies. From stranded assets to 100,000 barrels per day, from frozen dividends to fresh cash flow, from sanctions paralysis to strategic leverage. This is the hidden upside of Trump's Venezuela gamble. But it comes at a price. India will have to live with the contradiction, condemning instability in principle while quietly benefiting from its outcomes. But then there's a layer of diplomacy involved here. India cannot afford to rile Russia and China, and therefore, India would have to tread carefully between keeping the business in Venezuela going, working the DC circle so that Trump and Modi are on the same page, and yet not upsetting the Russia-China apple cart. India is walking a tightrope. On one side, values, sovereignty, and the expectations of the global south. On the other, energy security, corporate gains, and hard economic interests. In Venezuela, Trump has redrawn the rules of power. For India, the question now is not whether opportunity exists, but whether it can seize it without losing its balance. Thank you for watching Statecraft.